In 1965, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was sent to the home of a family friend, Gertrude Baniszewski, while her parents were on work travels making ends meet. But when Sylvia's parents returned home from their travels, their young daughter was no longer alive. Gertrude Baniszewski and her young children tortured Sylvia Likens to death. The culprits even managed to involve an entire neighbourhood of kids to help them commit this brutal murder. The autopsy was straight out of a horror scene, as it showed just how disgusting and unimaginable the torture must have been before she died. The worst thing above all is that her killers faced almost no justice at all. I want to make this very clear now that this video is past disturbing, and it's certainly not for the faint-hearted. Viewer discretion has never been advised more than it is now. Without any further ado, let's get into the horrifying case of Sylvia Likens' torture party. Sylvia Likens' parents were both carnival workers and therefore on the road more often than not. They struggled to make ends meet, as their father barely finished school and with a low-paying job had a total of 5 children to care for. Jenny, Sylvia's sister, was quiet and withdrawn and had been suffering with poliovirus, which resulted in her having struggles walking. Sylvia, on the other hand, was the more confident of the bunch and was described as pretty, though she did have a missing front tooth. In July 1965, Sylvia's mother was jailed for shoplifting and their financial situation worsened. Lester Likens needed to get involved in the carnival that summer to make some extra cash. Sylvia's brothers, Danny and Benny, were put into the care of their grandparents. With few other options, Sylvia and Jenny were sent away with a family friend named Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude was in just as bad as a financial position as the Likens and had several kids of her own to support in her rundown home. She made a humble living by charging her neighbours a few dollars to iron their laundry. She had already been through multiple divorces, some of which resulted in physical abuse against her, and she dealt with deep depression through heavy doses of prescription drugs. She was in no condition to take care of an additional 2 teenage girls, but the Likens family didn't have any other option at the time. Lester Likens had requested that Gertrude straighten his daughters out when he placed them in her care for just $20 a week. For the first 2 weeks, Sylvia and her sister were treated well, though Gertrude's oldest daughter, 17-year-old Paula, seemed to not take a liking to Sylvia, and they often clashed, though no physical altercations ever pursued. But everything changed when Lester's third payment for the babysitting came late. Gertrude flew into a fit of rage and shouted and spat at the teenage girls. She grabbed Sylvia by the arm, dragged her into a room and closed the door. Jenny could only sit outside the door and hear the screams of her sister. This was the start of the most horrific acts any child could ever go through. The money arrived in the mail the same day after the beating. Sylvia and Jenny's parents came a few days later and gave another advance payment. The sisters said nothing of the beating. Gertrude soon began to abuse both Sylvia and Jenny in broad daylight. Although she was a frail woman, Gertrude used heavy household objects to inflict pain. After hours of torture and beatings, Gertrude eventually got tired and asked her daughter Paula to step in and take her place. As you could expect, Sylvia became the focus of the forthcoming abuse. Gertrude demanded that Sylvia's sister Jenny join in or take her sister's place at the end of the belt and other weapons that they were using. A young, scared Jenny, already suffering with poliovirus, had no other option but to join in on the torturing of her own sister. Gertrude started to accuse Sylvia of stealing from her, which gave her an excuse to burn the little girl's fingertips. The method of torture took a strange twist as she took Sylvia to a church function and forced her free hot dogs until she was sick. Then, as a punishment for throwing up good food, she forced her to eat her own vomit. She encouraged her children to get involved in the abuse of Sylvia. Gertrude's children used Sylvia as a rag doll, practicing their karate on her, kicking, punching, and slamming her into walls and onto the floor. They used her skin as an ashtray, threw her downstairs, cut open her skin, and rubbed salt into her wounds. After this, she would often be cleansed in a scalding hot bath. This was just the start, and it got worse than you can ever imagine. Gertrude, the demented pensioner, forced her children to do some unthinkable things. She had her daughter Paula mutilate Sylvia's private parts, accusing her of being pregnant. Gertrude's 12-year-old son, John Jr., forced Sylvia to eat his younger sibling's feces from his diaper. We can't cover everything that happened to Sylvia simply because it's way too graphic to relate to you all, but the research is there should you want to look into it. But all you do need to know is that Sylvia was subjected to absolute depravity and acts of torture a sane mind couldn't think of. Sylvia was beaten so bad that she was unable to use the bathroom voluntarily. When she wet her mattress, Gertrude decided that the girl was no longer fit to live with the rest of the children, so she locked the 16-year-old victim in a dark basement without food or access to a bathroom. Gertrude spread every story she could imagine to get the local kids to join in on the beatings. Some of the kids opened up about how Gertrude had recruited them. One teenage girl named Anna Cisco recalled how Gertrude told her that Sylvia had been saying bad things about her mother. Gertrude told her, "I don't care what you do to Sylvia," and invited her over to the home just to watch this young girl beat the life out of Sylvia, as if it was some kind of twisted entertainment for her. But in the end, I guess it was exactly that. Gertrude told her own children that Sylvia was a prostitute. Then she had a neighbourhood boy and her 11-year-old daughter Marie carve the words, "I am a prostitute and I am proud of it," into her abdomen with a heated needle. As time went on, the Likens family became concerned about their lack of communication with Sylvia and Jenny, and her older sister Diana attempted to see the girls but was turned away at the door. Jenny later reported how Diana snuck food into the basement in which Sylvia was hidden. A neighbour had a bad feeling that something was happening at the Baniszewski home and reported the incidents to the public health nurse, who upon entering the home and not seeing Sylvia concluded that nothing was wrong. Another neighbour next door allegedly were aware of how Sylvia was abused. They had seen Paula strike the girl in the home on 2 separate occasions, but claimed not to report the abuse because they feared for their own lives. Jenny was threatened, bullied, and beaten by the Baniszewskis and the young children in the neighbourhood to scare her from going to the authorities. The abuse of Sylvia only got worse. "I'm going to die," Sylvia told her sister 3 days before she did. "I can tell," she heartbreakingly said. Gertrude could tell too, based on the ungodly punishment that she had absorbed, so she forced Sylvia to write a note which told her parents that she'd run away. Sylvia was also forced to write that she met up with a group of boys and had given them sexual favours, and then afterward they had beaten her and mutilated her body. Shortly after this, Sylvia overheard Gertrude tell her children that she was going to take Sylvia to a forest and leave her there to die. A desperate Sylvia attempted one final escape. She managed to get out the front door before Gertrude caught her. Sylvia was so weak from her injuries that she could not possibly have gotten far. With the assistance of a neighbour boy named Coy Hubbard, Gertrude beat Sylvia with a curtain rod until she fell unconscious. Then, once she gained consciousness, she and others in the house stamped on her head. Sylvia later died from this final beating on October 26, 1965. The cause of death was from a brain hemorrhage, shock, and malnutrition. After 3 months of torture and starvation, she could no longer form understandable words and could barely move. When police came, Gertrude stuck with her cover story. Sylvia had been out with boys in the woods, she told them. They had beaten her to death and carved "I'm a prostitute and proud of it" onto her body. Jenny, though, took her chance. As soon as she can get close enough to the police officer, she whispered, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The police arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Baniszewski, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard for the murder, along with 5 other neighbourhood participants for injury to person. These minors would end up blaming Gertrude for being pressured to partake in the massacre of Sylvia Likens. Gertrude herself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. She's not responsible because she's not all there, her defense attorney told the court. There were several more children involved who proved just too young to be charged. Ultimately, on May 19th, 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was spared the death penalty, despite her own lawyer admitting that, in my opinion, she ought to go on the electric chair. Paula Baniszewski, her daughter, was convicted of second-degree murder and was also sentenced to life imprisonment. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter and given 2 21-year prison sentences based on the fact that they were minors. All 3 boys were all paroled just 2 years later in 1968. Gertrude spent 20 years behind bars. There's no question about her guilt. The autopsy backed up everything Jenny told the police. Sylvia Likens had died slowly and painfully over several months. In 1971, both Gertrude and Paula were retried, and thankfully, Gertrude was once again found guilty. Paula pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 42 years. She once even managed to escape despite being recaptured. After about 8 years behind bars, Paula was released and she was moved to Lower, where she changed her name and worryingly became a teacher's assistant. She was suspended from her position in 2012 when an anonymous caller tipped off the school district that Paula was once convicted of the death of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. Gertrude Baniszewski was granted parole on good behaviour on December 4th, 1985. Jenny and a whole crowd of people picketed outside the prison to protest her release, but it was no use. Gertrude Baniszewski was a free woman. The only relief Jenny received came 5 years after Gertrude's release, when she died of lung cancer. A happy Jenny wrote to her mother saying, "Good news, damn old Gertrude died, and I'm happy about that. And believe me, I would be too after what she went through." Jenny never did blame her parents for what happened to her sister. Jenny even said, "My mum was a really good mum. All she did was trust Gertrude." The death of Sylvia Likens continues to haunt Indianapolis as the worst crime ever committed in the state. Prosecutor Leroy New says, "This case has never had its equal. It is the most vicious thing, the most hideous thing Indiana has ever seen." That's it for today's video. I hope you found this one interesting. I did tell you from the beginning that this one was going to be extremely disturbing, so I hope I haven't scared anyone away. If you like this sort of content, please let me know in the comments down below and subscribe to the channel, and I'll try and find something as equally disturbing as this one. So hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.